In this video, I want to go ahead and define the three fundamental concepts that you need to understand to be successful with reactive extensions and reactive programming in general. I mean, these concepts apply to the entire paradigm as a whole, and they're so fundamental. You need to understand these. These are the core concepts. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'll define these three things, and then we're going to move over and I'm going to show you examples of how we can apply this paradigm to things that you might think are obvious fits, and for some things that you might not think are obvious fits for this paradigm, but work very well. So let's start with observables. What's an observable? Well, an observable is a thing that can be observed. I mean, it's kind of in the name. And what it does is it produces values, and that's it. And it can terminate successfully or unsuccessfully, or it can go on forever and keep on producing values, or maybe it'll stop producing values for a little bit, then start producing values again, blah, 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 whatever. An observable is a thing that produces values. What is an operator? Well, an operator is a operation. It's a thing that modifies the data that's being pushed in from the observable. It can even control the observable in certain ways, and we'll talk about an example of that later in this video. It's important to understand, though, that an operator returns an observable, much in the same way that in LINQ in C#, you have an IEnumerable, and then you apply an operator, such as where, select on it, and you get back another IEnumerable, where you can add another operator to it. So the cool thing about operators is they don't produce values in and of themselves. They take the values from a previous observable, but they move it through the pipeline, so you can chain multiple operators together. We saw examples of that in the last video. And then finally, at the end, we have subscriptions. What's a subscription? Well, a subscription is the piece of code that'll actually do something with the values that were returned by the observables. And that's it. So let's move on and talk about some examples. So, come on. First of all, we have mouse movements. Remember, everything is a database. So mouse movements is a very obvious sort of thing that fits in this paradigm. It fits very well into this paradigm. So let's talk about what this diagram represents. Well, the diagram represents each one of these blue boxes is an individual mouse move event that is generated by the mouse move observable, which you could acquire by simply doing the from event on a document node and passing in the mouse move event as the thing to subscribe on. And you notice that it produces all these values. Next, 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 next. And then these values get transformed. And I'm representing my transformation here in an abstract sense. I'm turning a square into a circle, but obviously you could do whatever you want. You can chain your operators and have a fun time with that. And then finally we have our subscriptions that actually do the thing, do something. They cause a side effect. They actually perform an action. Like, I don't know, maybe you move your mouse and the background of your page tints based off how quickly you're moving your mouse, or maybe if you move your mouse to the right hand corner, the background will change or do something different. Whatever you can think of is the action of what you want to have happen once a value is produced. That's what the subscriptions are for. So mouse movements, you'll notice it never completes. It continuously produces an event, and this is a common form of observable that we would create. Next up, we have reading files from a directory. Now that's a weird one. You might not really consider reading files from a directory as an observable. I mean, traditionally, you'd think, I read these files and I get back an array and everything is awesome. I loop over that array and I perform my transformations and then I do my side effects. And then you get code that has 20 levels of indentation and is super messy, relies on global state, and looks like that first autocomplete example. Well, what we can do is we can model reading files from a directory in the context of observable. Remember, I said this earlier, you can model anything in a reactive context by thinking about things a little bit differently. So let's talk about this diagram. When we read a file from a directory, or read all files from a directory, we'll get individual files, and they'll be produced by these nexts, and then we'll have our RxJS operators be applied to them to transform that data into whatever we want. And then we finally get the final value and we perform an operation with that. I want to point out, though, that there is not necessarily a one-to-one mapping between our operators and subscriptions as far as these individual items. Maybe we have an operator that merges a bunch of lines from a file together and buffers them into arrays of 100 elements. So in that case, we would have 100 of these individual reads, individual nexts, but we might only have one subscription next, and that's a valid thing that we can do, and we'll look at operators that do that. But to keep things simple, we just conceptualize it as each file goes through the entire pipeline and comes out the other end. But then this thing happens, complete. What does complete do? Well, complete is one of the signals we have access to in an observable. And a complete simply says, okay, I pushed you all my values, I have no more, I'm done, I'm unsubscribing, disposing of all of my resources, and going away forever. And that's what complete does. And in that case, that makes sense from reading files from a directory. You're going to get a bunch of items, and then it's going to have no more items to give you, and then it's going to finish. And completing doesn't produce a new item, but it does signal to the subscription that it is complete. You'll have another callback on your subscription that allows you to handle a complete event. So again, this is an example of something you don't really think of as an observable sequence. You would think of this as an iterable or an array or something like that, but it doesn't have to be. We can model anything in this paradigm. So let's talk about something that definitely doesn't seem like an observable sequence. A web API request. And now this is another common thing that you might do in reactive programming. You might hook into an observable that may only produce one value, and then it'll finish. And that's what this does. A web API request produces that value and then completes. So we get that value, we get its transformation, and we get our subscription. Our subscription gets the result of that transformation. But why would you do it that way? Why would you bother turning this into a reactive workflow as opposed to just using a promise or something like that? Well, before I answer that, I'm going to scroll over to our last example here and talk about error conditions. An error is like a complete, except for in the sense that it terminates the observable, and the observable will no longer produce values after an error. By the way, an observable can produce values before an error, but an error does produce a value. It produces a error object, and that value gets passed all the way down to the subscription, so we can get data about the error. But so why would we want to model something like a web API request, something that only ever produced one value? I mean, what's the point of making a observable workflow when we only have one value that we care about? Well, the answer is by modeling something in a reactive way, using reactive extensions, we get access to all of the functionality of reactive extensions, including functionality that would allow us to retry a web API request if it fails. We could write one line of code that says, if this fails, if this request fails, and let's say we throw a predicate in it. Let's say if this request fails and it failed because of a transient issue, not a complete failure like unauthorized or something like that, but it happened as a transient issue, an issue that might be resolved if we wait a second and then requery it. One line of code, and it restarts the workflow. And that's really the power here. That's the power is we can, once we start thinking reactively and we kind of take all these things that we wouldn't traditionally think as being sources of events and model it as sources of events, we get access to the ridiculous amount of awesome and powerful operators given to us by reactive extensions or whatever reactive framework you might be using. Furthermore, you gain the idea of composition. Remember the last video, we had our getItems method that returned a promise. And we hooked it into an actual reactive workflow, or reactive workflow that worked against our keyUp event, and we hooked it right into that workflow. And we were able to do that because we then started to think of the web request, the getItems method, as being a part of that pipeline. And that gives us so much power and flexibility to be very, very descriptive. So start thinking, though, the purpose of this video is for you guys to start thinking in terms of how we can take the sort of traditional things that we might have done in the past and how we can flip it on its head and start thinking in a push model as opposed to a pull model. We're not looping through an array. We're simply saying, hey, object, if you have a new value, give it to me. And that opens up so much expressiveness and functionality and capability that we're going to see a lot of examples of in the coming videos. But anyway, those are the examples that I wanted to talk about. Again, things that you might not traditionally think of as reactive. They can very well be. You just have to think differently, adjust your mind to start accepting the new paradigm, and move forward. All right, so that's about it for this video. In the next video, we're going to look at how we can create observables. And we'll see you guys then.